Aid Talks is an educational series discussing the most pressing issues on aid and development cooperation today and the critical issues surrounding it. Co-hosted by Aid Watch Australia and the Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, Aid Talks aims to inform the public on how official development assistance, or ODA, commonly known as aid, provided by donor countries to developing nations and fragile states, is being utilised as aid investment, redirected to support private sector players and narrow security priorities over reducing inequality and poverty.
Good afternoon and good evening to our participants, speakers, and panelists. So today is our webinar about the decolonizing aid, entitled "Reparations and Resilience: Decolonizing Aid." Decolonizing climate finance, rather. So this Aid Talks webinar series is hosted by Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, a network of over 80 CSOs working on aid and development cooperation, and Aid Watch Australia, an independent body monitoring Australian aid. Just before we start, there are a couple of Zoom protocols. So for everyone's information, this webinar is recorded and live streamed in our Aid Talks Facebook page and YouTube channel. During the event, if you wish to raise some questions or thoughts, please send in your questions and comments through the Zoom chat, or use the raise hand function in Zoom, so we can call you in order for you to speak during the webinar. Also, when raising your questions, make sure to make them concise so we can cater many questions within the allotted time for the webinar. So to formally start our webinar, I would like to introduce our facilitator for the event, Mitzi Jonel Tan. Mitzi Jonel Tan is a full-time climate justice activist based in Metro Manila, Philippines. She is the convener and international spokesperson of Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines, or YACAP, the Fridays for Future of the Philippines, and she is also an organizer with FFF International and FFF MAPA, or Most Affected Peoples and Areas, making sure that voices from the global south especially are heard, amplified, and given space. A strong voice on anti-imperialism, anti-colonization, and the intersectionality of the climate crisis, she is committed to changing the system and building a world that prioritizes people and planet, not profit, through collective action. Let us welcome our facilitator, Mitzi.
Hello, everyone. I still can't seem to turn my video on, but thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited for this topic today because it is such an important issue. So as mentioned, we have a very interesting topic today where we will be talking about reparations and resilience for the 5th Aid Talks. Our speakers will discuss pertinent matters and crucial issues about decolonization of climate finance, seeing our reality right now where there's a lack of commitment to mobilize sufficient financing for countries in the global south, especially to adapt to the climate crisis impacts, and how that contributes to exacerbation of inequalities and further degradation of the environment. We're also seeing how there's a lack of control of frontline communities over the use of this much needed finance, which means that it gets rid of this ownership over their development priorities and puts their lives further at risk. It's also important to note how majority of climate finance that's being provided today are in the form of loans. And so that means we have countries in the global south going into debt because of the impacts of the climate crisis that the global north caused. And so when we're demanding for climate finance, for climate reparations, really, it has to be in the form of grants and not loans. And again, ensuring that when you provide aid and these grants, that there are no neoliberal policies that come along with it, which happens quite often, especially in the Philippines. And in time for COP27 happening from the 6th to the 18th of November, so this is next week in Egypt, this webinar will shed light about the need for development actors to increase their climate finance commitments, and that should be additional to their official development assistance disbursements, as well as the urgency really to decolonize this resource in order to effectively address the climate emergency that threatens the lifeline of individuals, communities, and the planet. I will be at COP27 next week in Egypt, and we are, as the young people, as with Fridays for Future, calling for climate reparations. And the majority of climate finance that's being provided today are in the form of loans. And we in Egypt, and we are, as the young people, as with Fridays. And so we're calling on everyone really who's watching this webinar today to also keep an eye out and talk about what's happening at COP, because there's less civil society space this year, there's less media presence. And so we need to make sure that it's not just the conversations aren't just happening in these sessions and in these rooms, but really across the world, demanding for decolonization of climate finance. And in this webinar, hopefully you will have the insights and we'll learn about crucial discussions about adaptation, mitigation, loss and damage, which will also be tackled to understand what kind of climate action the world really needs and why it's urgent to take appropriate measures as early as now. And to open us up, our first speaker will be giving us an overview of climate finance and decolonization of aid. They are Shed Jahangir Hassan Masoom, who has been working as a human rights and development activist for the last 18 years to realize social, economic, and climate justice. Since 2008, he has been serving as the executive director of Coastal Development Partnership, a national research and advocacy-focused not-for-profit organization in Bangladesh. He is also the chairperson of Reality of Aid Asia Pacific. Masoom acts as people's advocate both in national and international arena. He has conducted many researches on climate risks, development effectiveness, public-private partnership, low-carbon development, just energy transition, renewable energy, and impact of global challenges such as the climate crisis, but also the financial crisis and the food crisis. And he is also active in the Asia Pacific Regional Civil Society Engagement Mechanism, Asia Pacific Research Network, Reality of Aid Network, High Level Political Forum and SDGs, Climate Action Network South Asia, and the OECD DAC CSO reference group. So we have a very, very seasoned speaker coming up for us. With that, I'd like to call you on, Masoom.
Okay, I cannot open my video. Thank you, Messi, for nice introduction, and I hope that people will bear with these complicated issues. And I'm very happy to give an overview because what I think is trying to interrelate decolonization and climate finance is a kind of a very pioneering effort through these 8 talks, because many of us had a kind of a confusion. What is the difference between development finance or climate finance? What is the difference between ODA or climate aid? So I think my role is basically to simplify the key terms and also to highlight the characteristics of the donors in terms of the colonization approach. And also I will take some shade on the expectation from COP27, because I think the discussion from this webinar or 8 talks will also enrich activists during the COP27 process. So first, let me start. Like we all know that climate change can hamper development results, and the development choices that we will take today or we are taking today can also change Earth's climate. So both are, it might seem that both are very much interrelated. This really gives a challenge for the international negotiations to define climate finance and its relationship to aid, especially to scale up international climate finance. If we look for all the global policy framework, Paris Climate Agreement, Sendai Framework, Addis Ababa Action Agenda, and 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we will see that all these frameworks provided a clear role and responsibility for mobilizing climate finance. And this role is basically divided into two groups, one for the developed countries, one for the developing countries. So the role for the developed countries are to mobilize and increase international climate finance. And for the developing countries, the role is to strengthen or increase their domestic climate finance. So now, if we think about the decolonization, many of us might not know that we are still living kind of under colonization because this is currently the fourth international decade for the eradication of colonialism from 2021 to 2030. So, and the first decade started in 1990. So this is the UN process, and UN has officially recognized this the need for eradication of colonialism. Also, the UN really tried to boost that. The wave of decolonization was born with the UN. And they said that since the creation of the United Nations, 80 former colonies have gained their independence. But let me say this, decolonization cannot be achieved automatically by independence. Many of might think that, okay, we are independent, we are not under any influence of our former colonial dictator. But what we feel that decolonization should be considered as a process to unmask and dismantle all form of colonialist power, imperialist power, and values. So I will discuss later more. Now come to the point, climate finance and ODA or aid. There is a clear distinction between ODA and climate finance if we consider the purpose. For the purpose of ODA is to reduce poverty. And the purpose of climate finance, in a simple term, to reduce climate risk and vulnerabilities. So there shows a clear differentiation in core objectives. And when we call about the ODA or aid, it is basically the concessional finance or technical assistance from the developed countries to the developing countries. So now, although there is no definition of what is climate-related ODA or climate aid, what I personally believe that we should consider climate-related ODA or climate aid, which are new and additional to existing ODA for supporting the mitigation and adaptation actions needed to address climate change in developing countries. However, we have to keep in mind there is still no consensus on the methods of reporting new and additional climate finance. There is a definition given by the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance. Basically, they consider climate finance is the finance that aims at climate mitigation and climate adaptation. So this definition still need to address the loss and damage issue as well. Usually in the world, the climate finance delivers basically a couple of mechanisms. One is the non-market approaches, that is basically to a direct concessional flows or transfer of funds from recipient governments. And there is another one is private sector initiatives using existing ODA mechanisms or blended finance. And there is a third one is the use of market-based instruments such as international or domestic emission trading systems. There is also a mechanism under the UNFCCC to mobilize climate finance, such as Green Climate Fund and Global Environmental Facility. Now I will come current aid structure, how basically it contains the legacy of colonialism. There is no written rule, but we also, if we see clearly the disbursement pattern of the aid, we will see a former colony-centric approach. Like for example, in Bangladesh, we get most of the support from also the UK. And all, for example, the Indonesia gets from Netherlands as a priority country, the African country from the France. So this has created a problem. What kind of problem? Because the former, when you put the funds or aid for the former colonies, you have created a 8 darlings and 8 orphans. Because you have a preference for some countries, not their actual need, but basically what the donors feel their interest. So, for example, one study has found that Egypt, Turkey, and Mexico are 8 darlings among the other countries. On the other hand, Bangladesh, Tanzania, Ethiopia, and Democratic Republic of Congo are 8 orphans. So, if these former colony-centric approaches are not in the practice, then the current aid have to reallocate it in a different way. And if you have to now reallocate it, you have to reallocate 50% of the current aid distributions from the 8 darlings to 8 orphans. That's a big value. And also, I would say that in the climate finance context, donors basically aims at financing the transition to a carbon neutral economy. That will be the resilient to climate change. And this economy is basically for their geostrategic and commercial fulfillment. And access to climate finance is basically influenced by donors' interest, not the actual needs. If we see that, then you will see that currently 80% of the climate finance portfolio is dedicated to mitigation. Only 20% goes to adaptation. And since 2011, the adaptation portfolio of this 20% remains more or less same, only a simple variations in the year age. And OECD DAC members, basically, they define new and additional climate functions the way they say fit with their analysis. Many of the studies, for example, Oxfam studies, have found that many donors either overvalue the net amount of money transferred to recipient countries or overestimate the climate finance element. This is also a colonialist approach or imperialist attitude. Donors basically tend to mobilize their climate finance outside the UNFCCC process so that they can serve their own interest and they can ensure their visibility. And donors also deliberately ignore environmental governance principles. So the polluter principles or principles of equity, they cannot be really enacted strongly. If it goes through the UNFCCC process, then you have to follow these principles. That's why they also really like to see the fund disbursement outside the. So now, why decolonisation of climate finance? How we can do that? One thing, climate finance should be treated differently from the normal ODA. Climate finance should be considered as an investment for present and future humanity. So it's not a charity, it's an investment for humanity. And climate finance should mean new and additional ODA. And country system and country plans should be the central driver of climate finance if we want to delocalize colonization. Because currently the international political economy drives decision about climate finance. And also the least developed countries, their priority should be highlighted because their priority is adaptation. And as the basic principle of climate justice, the developing countries should not pay developed countries in terms of principal interest on loans as climate finance. And finally, I would just highlight expectations of the UNFCCC COP27, that is happening soon. So this COP is basically, I personally believe, it's time for transforming commitment into actions. And here commitments is basically known as nationally determined contributions. Because in the COP20, basically 4 agendas will be discussed: climate finance, adaptation, loss and damage, and increased ambition. And what my expectation, basically, I want to see the decisions on implementation of the Paris Agreement in this COP27, and decision on implementation of the Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program on the global goal on adaptation. I also want to see that establishment of the Sharm el-Sheikh work program on mitigation, ambition, and implementation to help countries increase ambition. And also, we want consensus on establishing a financing facility for loss and damage to developing countries, and also finalize arrangements to officially launch the Santiago network on loss and damage. And also, this COP should finalize Sharm el-Sheikh climate finance delivery plan, meeting the US 100 billion goal by 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Masoom, for that very, very important and lovely explanation and very clear and concise demands. So now we will be going on to the next part of our webinar, which will be a panel discussion. But before that, if you guys have any questions, I'd like to point you guys out to the Q&A button in the below. You can click that and you can ask any questions, and we will be going over them in later. So now we will be let me introduce our wonderful panelists. We have Mariam Al-Ajaa on adaptation. Mariam is the general manager of the Arab Group for Protection of Nature. She holds a master's degree in development economics from SOAS, University of London, and a BA in international development from Leeds University. She works and published papers in the areas of rural development, food security, agriculture, land, and conflict response. We also have Josiah Osborne, who will be talking to us about mitigation. Josiah is the Deputy Director of the Pacific Islands Association of Non-Governmental Organizations, which is a regional network of umbrella NGOs from 24 Pacific Island countries and territories who are rethinking development and reshaping the Pacific that we want by 2030. And on loss and damage, we have Wali Haider, who is the Joint Director of Roots for Equity and has been serving the organization for more than 20 years now. Roots for Equity works with marginalized communities, especially the small and landless farmers, including religious minorities and women, and in this context strongly advocates food sovereignty. In his early years at the organization, Haider was also involved in youth environmental education programs as a community educator and campaigner, and he also took part in the formation of an independent mass-based platform for small and landless farmers, namely the Pakistan Kisan Mazdoor Tehreek. He also plays an active role in advancing the struggle for land rights and seed sovereignty. Currently, he is also the focal point for farmers constituency for APR-CEM. So without further ado, I'd like to invite our panelists to turn on their videos and to... Our first question is, how does the current aid structure further perpetuate colonialism and neoliberalism, and which further contributes to environmental degradation?
Okay, so how does the current aid structure further perpetuate colonialism and neoliberalism? So the current aid structure endorses the same capitalist system that encourages profit accumulation by some at the cost of others, but using cleaner and more efficient technologies. And as depicted by a researcher called Raiden Roy, he said, yesterday's fossil fuel tycoons are today's low carbon billionaires. So the aid structure currently advocates for the use of quote unquote green products and technologies that support what they call green economy. But these technologies are manufactured by industrialized countries and they support neoliberal approaches of production and consumption. So the second aspect to look at is how the current aid system advocates for downsizing the agricultural sector in the global south, which is one of the most harmed sectors by climate change, as opposed to downsizing or restricting other sectors that are much more harmful, such as the arms industry or the transport industry. And the problem with that is that if governments in less developed countries continue to be pressured to mitigate carbon emissions through restricting their farming sector, we will have a situation with a drop in agricultural production in the south and further deterioration of food insecurity, which has already reached very bad and unprecedented levels. This will further the concentration and monopoly of international agribusiness in food production, and the globalized food system currently has proven to have the most harmful impact on the environment, unlike the traditional, diversified farming practiced by our small farmers in the south. What we've witnessed in Jordan and other governments in our region is that governments are, the aid structure at the moment is treating our governments as subcontractors. So it's cementing the lack of sovereignty and agency of our governments. And they're acting, and our governments at the moment do not have screening policies for projects or environmental projects. So they are the priorities of the West or in the industrialized region is being imposed on our region. And here I can give an example, which is the many projects that are being, offered to Jordan to cultivate trees, but most of these projects are prioritizing trees that are non-productive, and only for the aim of carbon, sequestration or absorption of CO2. But when we demanded as civil society that we wanted to plant trees that are both environmentally but also have economic and nutritional value, so we can enhance the food sovereignty of Jordan, we were denied that. So, and this is really dangerous because it really links climate finance to furthering the subjugation of this region and neoliberal policies, particularly in the agricultural sector. Particularly because the Arab region is one of the most dependent on food imports globally. So our contribution to global emissions is really trivial. So asking the Arab region to cut down on agriculture is something really, serves the agendas of countries that are, industrialized and have been using us as markets. So the aid structure at the moment is forcing poorer countries to develop without using fossil fuels. And this is really unjust because this part of the world has a right to development. And if any support should be given to this part of the world, it should be by adaptation, by adapting our economic sectors to the harms of climate change and to try to recover the loss and damage we have witnessed in the past decades. And disregarding the imbalance in responsibility between the global north and the global south in industrialization, capital accumulation, and consumption will further environmental degradation. And we have to also remember that the climate change intersects with other vulnerabilities and other social and political injustices. So the aid industry at the moment is not recognizing that there are certain structural causes that are leaving communities susceptible to the impact of climate change, such as war, occupation, settler colonialism, class, racism. All of these structural causes are leaving us more vulnerable. The aid industry is not assisting us in, enhancing our adaptation capacities. And finally, I'd like to say that the aid industry at the moment is marginalizing genuine movements and NGOs in our part of the world, and giving more space for co-opted civil society organizations. And just to give a quick example is one of the COP conferences that took place in Qatar, I remember a few years back. The Arab civil society representatives that were supported by the EU were asked to hold the slogan, or to champion the slogan of Arabs take the lead in carbon emission reduction. And as you know, most of the Arab countries are non-industrialized countries, they're non-productive countries, and seeing Arab civil society representatives holding the banner of us taking the lead rather than the North and the industrialized countries taking the lead was very sad to see. So this is pretty much in a nutshell what I think. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Mariam. And it's the same here in the Philippines, where they plant trees, but the trees that they're planting are the ones that they can profit off of. So they're not endemic trees, they're trees that they use for export. And you talked a lot about food security and agriculture. So Wally, I was wondering if you wanted to answer the question next on how the current aid structure further perpetuates colonialism and neoliberalism and contributes to environmental degradation.
Thank you, Messi, for your facilitation. Thanks for Aid Watch and Reality of Aid for organizing such an important, especially just before a COP. You see, not related to, particularly related to climate finances. But of course, I would like to add what Masoom says. There are various kind of climate finance, which is international public finance, sources and multilateral development banks and bilateral corporations. But as Mariam mentioned, that most of it, and Masoom also mentioned, most of it goes for mitigation work and mostly designed in the new liberal market-based framework, and which is green bond and debt finance, debt for climate swap. All these you can find is under the neoliberal framework. Nothing coming from the ground, from the communities who've been affected by the climate crisis. I'm not sure when you will ask me to discuss the recent, very recent, ongoing climate crisis effect in shape of flooding and heavy rain in Pakistan. So I'll also will, if you provide time, I'll talk on that as well. But on the food security part, we have now, earlier we used to have infrastructure project by the World Bank and many other in imperialist capitalist countries. But now we have a heavy infrastructure project by China, which is called China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Thousands of hectares been, agriculture land have been deteriorated and dismantled just to construct a road from up north to my city Karachi, to the port city Karachi. And now, apart from all kind of these mega projects, there are Asian Development Bank and World Bank also financing a project from Pakistan to Afghanistan called Frontier Highway Project, which is financed by, as mentioned, Asian Development Bank and World Bank. Most of the land being converted into road is from the farming community, where food have been cultivated. And as you know, that recent flood, before that, due to the uncertain climate issues, there are lack of wheat production last year. This year there's flood, and then these infrastructure projects, and then now the war Ukraine and Russia, which is going to harm our food security in a very drastic manner. So on IMF, we just had a renegotiated term from IMF, and we had a bailout plan 2 months back, and it's the conditionalities put in place is such a harsh that now if even the upper middle class cannot afford to a decent life. Everything, cost of living have been basic food, vegetable, meat, anything you name it has been 200-300% risen. Petrol has been risen from 150 to 250. The currency devaluation from 170 to 225 now. So these conditionalities, with this economic crisis, with this climate crisis, really shrinking Pakistani, especially Pakistani rural communities and the working class in a mess. And as Masoom mentioned, these policies are supposed to facilitate and solve the issues, but it's intensify our crisis and our miseries, and since it's all coming from the G7 countries, from the industrialist capitalist nations, who are responsible for such an economic crisis or climate and crisis crisis, those who are they are being put in responsibility to take burden of at least provide their historical responsibility for creating this all kind of messes, not just climate crisis. So but I would like to add more on recent flood and its loss and damage on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wally. And Josiah, would you like to jump in on discussion also about the current aid structure and how, again, it further perpetuates colonialism and neoliberalism?
In terms of the current aid structure, I know that we have talked about development cooperation and development effectiveness that focuses on sustainable change to address the root causes as well as symptoms of poverty, inequality, and marginalization. But even with the various development cooperation principles in place and agreed to by our countries, the donors, private sector, and CSOs, there is still a lot that needs to be achieved within the climate change space, especially when we talk about climate mitigation. I know that I am requested to talk on climate mitigation, and there are some pertinent examples of how the current aid structure within the climate finance further perpetuating colonialism and neoliberalism in climate mitigation. One example is the carbon trading mechanisms, including the net zero, that are being imposed by the Global North. This initiative would actually transfer the Global North's responsibilities on reducing emissions to us in the Global South, and is a form of carbon colonialism for us in the Pacific, who are also small island, categorized as small island developing states, and we contribute only 0.03% of the total greenhouse gas emissions. 1.5 degrees means our survival. And if we continue to allow these rich countries to keep polluting, it meant the loss of our land, heritage, and identity, given the climate impacts that would be experienced by our communities. My second point that I would like to highlight is that the current climate finance flows are not tailored to our needs as small island developing states, which means that there is lack of ownership, and climate finance or aid is still tied or tied aid. Even the accessing these funds, as already highlighted earlier, in the Pacific is a challenge, and it would require our governments to go through an accredited institution. This further creates dependency. I would also like, my third point that I would like to highlight is on corporate. We are all aware of, in terms of mitigation, how businesses, much of them especially if we talk about corporate capture, how the oil companies are trying to water down some of the agreements, which includes phasing out fossil fuels. This is a form of a neoliberal model of development that does not take into account the values or the when we talk about social justice in especially on climate change. And finally, I would like to talk about greenwashing. We know that we can't use climate change as an excuse to greenwash mining the seafloor, because eventually those minerals do not serve us in the Pacific, but we continue the marketization of environmental services by servicing markets in the developed world. Especially when we talk about deep sea mining, there are arguments that it would assist in terms of mitigation. So deep sea mining or mining our ocean, for many of us in the Pacific, we depend on the ocean for our livelihood and well-being. It is our identity and our culture, and traditions are intertwined with the ocean. The ocean has the most critical planetary function, and that is providing oxygen to the planet. And for us in the Pacific, I believe that in terms of corporate capture and greenwashing, we've seen how these companies or mineral companies are trying to push through their agenda when it comes to, and are using the flag of mitigation, climate mitigation, as a tool in which they can extract resources. We have already seen how extractive industries have affected communities in the Pacific, and we do not want any of these things to happen again. Finally, on the question about debt burden, we know about the debt burden that will be created, and this is something that is tied to the current aid structure, especially the debt burden on climate mitigation or any other climate adaptation or loss and damage or any other climate actions that we try to do. Thank you. That's all from my side.
Thank you so much, Josiah. And I would like to just remind our wonderful panelists who have such great insights to try to keep within 3 minutes for our next question, just so that we can keep entertaining questions from the audience as well afterwards. So for our next question, I'd like to ask you guys, what does the decolonization of climate finance mean in each of your work? So whether mitigation, adaptation, or loss and damage efforts. And how do you guys think we can reimagine the climate finance that genuinely addresses the climate emergency? Mariam, would you like to start again?
Okay. So primarily what is needed is for the industrialized countries to reduce consumption and not, the poor populations of the world. And also to live up to their responsibility in not only mitigation, but also financing the recovery of the loss and damage that has happened to the different, economic sectors in the South, but also for adaptation. And so we need less focus on, climate temperature change, but more on preventing the impact on the environment, people, and the wider ecology. And in order to do that, we need to enhance country ownership and putting the communities, the impacted communities in the center of decision making. And this, of course, entails adaptation of the agricultural sector, as particularly support of smallholder farmers. So basically by, for instance, addressing crop loss by cultivating climate resilience crops, supporting water management, diversifying livelihoods, giving them access to information, but also protecting native seeds and seed banks that are climate resistant. And finally, to be able to, it's really, really essential to address the systemic inequalities and the structural causes that are leaving communities vulnerable. And we can only do that by protecting the rights of peoples. For instance, under occupation and settler colonialism, where the water rights are already violated, seed banks are being destroyed, people are under sanctions. So in order to enhance people's resilience in times, in the face of climate change, we need to look at these structural causes of vulnerability. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam, for constantly reminding us that it is a structural issue and a structural problem. The climate crisis is a symptom of that profit-oriented imperialist system that we have today. And Josiah, would you like to go next for this one? Or maybe Wally. Oh, there, Josiah, go ahead.
In terms of the questionnaire, in terms of decolonization of climate finance for mitigation, climate mitigation, it means that any climate finance initiatives flows directly to the affected communities and recognizes traditional knowledge. For us, at the Pacific Island Association of NGO, we believe more in the localization agenda, where local actors determine the local agenda. And as already highlighted earlier, there's ownership. So there is a need for ownership in order to ensure decolonization of climate finance, and also a need to guarantee access to finance and the creation of more equitable finance arrangements, beginning with a review of regional and international financial architectures with inputs from civil society organizations and other stakeholders. Yeah? In terms of existing efforts of the donor community to decolonize this finance at the regional level here in the Pacific, we have the Pacific Resilience Facility, which is being set up to provide financing options that put Pacific governments and institutions in control of climate finance for the Pacific. This is a financing mechanism that will provide a self-sustaining source of funding for small-scale projects to strengthen community resilience to the risks and impacts of climate change and disasters in vulnerable communities. This is finance facility, or the Pacific Resilience Facility, is actually it's unique because it is owned, led, and designed by the Pacific. But this is at the regional level and is also housed by a regional intergovernmental institution. But I would like to also highlight that at the CSO level in Piango, we also have the facility aiding local engagement, which actually bridge or is a nexus between climate and humanitarian action. While at the same time, there is also a Kiowa climate emergency declaration, where there is a finance mechanism that is being actually proposed specifically on for climate action. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josiah, for really emphasizing that point on climate debt, and how it is the global north that has a debt to countries in the global south, just like what Wally is explaining earlier, because of the impacts that we're already experiencing. So Wally, would you like to answer this question and also tell us a little bit about what your country has been going through?
So the climate imperialism that has led to one extreme climate event in another, destroying millions of acres of cultivatable land. Climate imperialism is monopoly capital's addiction to fossil fuel-based hyper-industrial production. I'm just laying down the structural causes which need to be dismantled to decolonize. No, addiction to fossil fuel-based hyper-industrial production. It is deleterious, toxic industrial production-based false solution in the name of climate smart technologies or climate finance. It ensures that nations facing hunger become dependent on industrial food and aid, along with technologies, further profit for their mega corporation. Only in these couple of months, there have been tremendous extreme climate events in India, Bangladesh, Philippines, Japan, Sudan, Italy, and apart from Europe and US. Recently, the flood in Pakistan, the damage and loss need assessment. It's a World Bank report says that it might not be entirely true. The assessment estimates total damage of exceed 14.9 USD billion, 14.9 billion USD. The total economic loss to reach about 15.2 billion USD. Estimated need to rehabilitation and reconstruction in the resilient way are at least 16.3 billions. So these are apart from that, only 9 lakhs 91 lakhs 8,473 livestock have been died. No, so the only source for the rural community, those who don't have land or those who have small land, only livelihood source is livestock. That win. Their house is no more there, their livestock is no more there, and their livelihood, the agriculture practice where they do their agriculture on the land, it is still on the water. So many of the communities cannot even sow their next crop for wheat, which is essential for our food. So this is, it's a very traumatic situation. People are still on the road, and there are no significant aid. Even the UN Secretary General itself visited Pakistan during those days, but there is no significant assistance and no real realization of the structural causes of this crisis. So as Mariam mentioned, how to decolonize, straightforward. We need to decolonize, delink this current development model, which is capitalist model. And we need to bring a genuinely democratic, transparent production system, political system, where we can make sure climate justice, economic justice. And how this is possible? Make them accountable to the people. And the demand is accountability to the people. Hence, we use a term called development justice. Development justice, where people has the power to maneuver the world, to run the world, to decide for themselves. Not few corporations, not the few imperialistic, elitist countries, those who run the world. No, how this can be possible? This is only possible when the developed imperialist capitalist country will recognize, and by our assertion, they realize that they have a historical responsibility to fulfill their responsibility for the loss and damages which have been happening everywhere in the third world, especially in Pakistan. Billions of dollars have been lost in many shapes for the recent flood, and no one is committing that. So that is very important. And then we need now to use the community's local wisdom, how this situation can be dealt with. Because I know in many parts of Pakistan, the grassroots people, the rural communities knows which crop to sow in which season, how many months, how many weeks a particular crop can need to be ready, so that before the monsoon season, the crop is ready. So unless or until we use the local wisdom and give power to our people and community, there will be no chance of decolonization for ourselves. And also, I would also like to agree with Mariam that, that seed saving, agroecological based agriculture, and sustainable agriculture, which is very important. And country like us, genuine agrarian reform is the most important demand. You do whatever you do across the world, but if you don't, the people, majority of the rural people who does not have land will not have a livelihood, a decent livelihood. So genuine agrarian reform is one of the important solution for the communities who are facing the miseries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wally. We have a question from the chat really briefly asking about what the climate financing facility that is locally led, that was specific. I think it was Josiah who talked about that. So Josiah, if you could type into the chat the name of the facility, it would be really great. And while we are gathering the questions from our audience, there is this comment from the Facebook Live that I'd like to read out, that decolonization starts with recognizing and empowerment of First Nation communities or the indigenous peoples, their rights to the natural environment and their identities, etc., in each post-colonized states. And as Wally was mentioning earlier, it is exactly that. We need to start with genuine land reform and give land back to the farmers, to the tillers. And that is how we start with the national liberations of our countries. And really, decolonization just really means fighting for the liberation of communities, right? Both of colonized, settler colonized, neocolonized communities and countries across the world. Without further ado, I will dive right into our first question from our audience. Basilio Madeira reads that, in Timor-Leste, we have also faced the tragic problem of climate. We have been hugely facing the ecological and environmental damage. Although there have been numerous projects aided mainly from the neoliberal agencies, multinational companies' investment, as well as the UN program through SDG program, coupled with the government's institutions program. But it seems that nothing has improved and changed in terms of food security. The same in the Philippines, I'd like to just say that. And also in terms of climate crisis and more beyond. Are there any other aids or alternative ways that we as the community, along with the agricultural union, can tackle? Who would like to answer that from our lovely speakers? I'll put the question in the chat as well so you can read it. Again, the question is, are there any other aids or alternative ways that we as the community, along with the agricultural union, can take? Mariam or Wally or Josiah, would you guys want to answer the question?
It's a difficult, it's a tough question.
It is a difficult question.
It's a difficult question, but what I think is we have, our countries have the right for this finance. We have the right to get this finance from the UN, from these governments, from these industrialized nations. what we need to demand for are monitoring and accountability mechanisms and participatory processes where we can set our priorities and hold governments, international organizations, even civil society organizations into account. And I think this is one route that we should be taking.
Thank you, Mariam. It is really important to call for that accountability and that transparency. I'll give an example of what we do in the Philippines, where when there are typhoons and storms here, it's civil society that comes together, led by grassroots movements. And of course, some of it won't be great, but the ones that actually work with the community organizers, that I think is the stuff that we can really support. That's what we do in my organization, Youth Advocates for Climate Action Philippines. We connect with the community organizers that have always been there, fighting for their democratic rights and their social justice rights. And those are the communities that we connect with. And that's, we ask them how, and we partner up with them in providing aid while we call for donations from the Filipinos, from the international community. Of course, it's not going to be as big and as enough, right? Because as what Mariam was mentioning, we have a right to this, not just aid, but these reparations, because they have a debt to us, as Josiah was mentioning earlier. The Global North has a climate debt to us and they have to pay for that. So we need to demand, and the existing aid that we're already seeing, we have to make sure that when we call for accountability, it's not just about the finance, but also making sure that no neoliberal policies come along with it. There are countless examples in the Philippines where the US provided financial aid after a typhoon, and then right after you can see that there were tax subsidies, there were, like that economic and social justice and climate justice aspect that Wally was mentioning earlier as well. Wally or Josiah, would you guys want to hop in on this question also? If not, we can move to the next question, where conflict and climate change are two interlinking issues that affect and influence each other. What are the demands to effectively channel finance and aid towards contexts that are both inflicted by climate and conflict-related issues? I will put that into the chat so you guys can see it. I think, was it one of our speakers was already detailing what what their demands were on effectively channeling finance and aid toward context. Would someone want to hop in?
Yeah, I think I touched on that. Of course, vulnerability to climate change is much more bigger in the global south, but mainly in countries that are suffering from crises, from conflict, from occupation. Resources are already usurped, destruction of, livelihoods, of seed banks, like in Iraq and Syria, the seed banks were stolen, of native species that are climate resistant. So it's all these aspects are really interlinked. And that's why we need more emphasis on a rights-based approach in these contexts. First, to protect and prevent these violations from happening, and also to remedy or to recover whatever has been harmed, but also to strengthen. I always speak about local food sovereignty and local food systems, because this is how these communities can really be empowered and get political sovereignty. And this is what we are actually doing in our work in Palestine by replanting the destroyed trees of Palestine. We've planted almost 3 million trees through local and regional resources. So we really, if anybody wants to exchange thoughts and ideas of how you can make this happen in your countries, we'll be happy to discuss this later.
Thank you. And Josiah, I think you also wanted to answer this question since you unmuted yourself.
Can you repeat the question again?
The question is, conflict and climate change are two interlinking issues that affect and influence each other. What are the demands to effectively channel finance and aid towards contexts that are both inflicted by climate and conflict-related issues?
Yeah. I think for us in the Pacific, there has been, we are talking about conflicts and climate change. Okay, yeah, there are from the work that we are doing in Kiribati regarding the fact that there is a spike in domestic violence due to climate change. When women, I'm sorry, it's a very sensitive issue. Women in Kiribati are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change, and this includes because women are mothers. As mothers, they have to give up water so that their other household or kids can have water, and so they do not have. They don't undergo any shower, and as a result, their husbands, because maybe because they haven't gone through the take any shower, their husbands are actually leaving them. So this creates a lot of conflict again between the marriage, in the marriage. In addition to that, I would like to highlight that, yeah, there are a lot of SRHR issues as a result of climate change, and women, I must confess that they are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. And as you are aware, Kiribati, there are water wash issues, water sanitation and hygiene issues that are mainly because it's overcrowded, and the seawater actually, their wells are being infiltrated with seawater, saltwater inundation in their wells. So when women don't take their shower, it creates a lot of conflict, especially when we're talking about marriage and reproduction, and it actually hinders reproduction. This was taken from our workshop earlier this year. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josiah. And I think we have a participant. Oh, Wally, yes, please join in.
We need to look into the root causes, no? And again, the structural causes of the conflicts and war. Majority of the conflict and war across the globe are politically motivated. For instance, the recent ongoing war, US proxy war, led by US, Ukraine and Russia, no? It's a prime example how war can be created. Just create we have example of Afghan war, when NATO enter into Afghanistan. War entails destruction, or conflict entails destruction, resulting in widespread toxic substance, dead wildlife, and an atmosphere choked with fumes. Militaries consume enormous amount of fossil fuel. Bombing and other methods of modern warfare directly harm wildlife and biodiversity. It's undermine local communities, movement, and life. You take example of Kashmir, you get example of Palestine, you get example of many other conflict regions. I know in India, the Manipur region, and in, of course, the country you are from, Philippines. These conflicts creating a lot of issues, including climate crisis, but it's a human crisis itself, and which is politically motivated. We need an international framework which make them accountable, those the forces, the imperialist forces, those who are responsible for creating this conflict. The conflicts, majority of these conflicts and war is not natural, it's created. Many conflicts in Pakistan, religious conflict, is being designed by imperialist forces to just divide and rule. So unless or until we talk about and we theorize the very political aspect of conflict and war, we are not going to deal with these issues. And of course, I fully agree with Mariam that local solutions need to be adopted, and people have to be more powerful, so that a true national liberation and sovereignty can be achieved, including food sovereignty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wally, for that strong voice. Zain Malvi, I think you want to ask a question. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. Can I be heard? All right. Thanks, folks. I wanted to ask a question from Mariam, who I think gave a really nice context to the, the background of the, the colonial and neoliberal frameworks within which we operate. So I had a more sort of, granular and specific question on the upcoming COP, and, what can be done to sort of push this kind of analysis through into actual, on ground specific kind of benefits that we can derive from the negotiations, or some kind of mechanisms we can push for. So I have two questions. One is, two thoughts. One is, we've already seen this attempt to decolonize climate finance, or more generally finance, in the shape of the Warsaw mechanisms and the Santiago network. And they've always been complaining about the issue, which is one, that you do not have a separate line of finance for loss and damages, which needs to be there. Everything is, taken over by this discussion on resilience and adaptation and mitigation. And the second is this concern that even if you were to go that route, the mechanisms of dispersal and the means by which they get to nations and they get to countries that need it, come with all those things that you described, all those tied up policy framework implications and all those, tied up sort of interventions through technical assistance and stuff. And I was wondering what would Mariam suggest that a nation such as, for instance, Pakistan, that just underwent the floods, like Wali really nicely described, what should such a nation be doing in negotiations to ensure that there is in fact a line of finance, a mechanism of dispersal, and a method for continuing to accrue that kind of benefit at that level in the upcoming years when they actually do negotiate, and what mechanisms should they be pushing for? Because it's fine to talk about monitoring, it's fine to talk about participation, it's fine to talk about those accountability mechanisms, but we're doing them in our head and in our, in our own private spaces, unless there's some specific architecture in the climate finance internationally that we can propose changing. So there's some specific architectural change that Mariam would propose.
Thank you so much, Zain, for the question. You are right. So far, the right to be compensated or financed for loss and damage has, not been accepted by northern countries. And if I might elaborate a little bit, loss and damage is not only economic or physical. When we come to analyze loss and damage, there's also the non-physical or the non-economic damage. The damage to, social relations and heritage and culture that is parallel to climate change. So it is really essential to work towards that. Now, I haven't been really personally to the previous COP in Paris, but when I was in Qatar, I realized that the civil society space in the climate change conference is very, very restricted. The space to speak, to try to influence, And it is, much less than other platforms I've been in, whether in, the UNEP or the Committee on World Food Security in Rome. I think the one on COP is really, really restricting for civil society. So I think one way is to try to give and push and demand as global civil society that we need more space in these conferences. And until we get to that point, we have to try to influence our own governments and empower our own governments to do more South-South cooperation in the negotiations and to represent our priorities more. So this is one of the tactics we managed to do on one of the platforms when we saw that civil society is not being given a lot of space, is to try to influence and mobilize and empower the governments who do have a voice and try to, build more integration and more like negotiation force among countries that are facing the same problems. So I hope this is useful.
If the admin permits, could I follow up? Marian, thank you for that. Just two thoughts on this. One, we found that this actually works. It has a counter, it sort of works the other way around, which is that typically the governments are hands in glove and so are the contractors, and the lines of finance then become extremely tied into interests that serve a very particular elite, and especially in countries that have been compromised this way through years of addiction to IMF and other loan sources, ADB, World Bank, and so on. This is a recurring problem. And so the creation of fiscal space through the government mechanisms is oftentimes counter. It works the other way around, right? It goes against a community interest. So that's one problem. And the other problem is that subnational spending or subnational lending, which is now a big thing with the World Bank, and it's starting to do that with Sindh, for instance, trying to isolate one of the provinces in Pakistan, is also carries similar concerns, which is that you bring in contractors that also target local elites, industrial and governmental. And so given that we are working within the backdrop that you rightly pointed out as, colonized to this degree and neoliberal to this degree, that may not necessarily be a very viable option. Given that that's the case, is there a mechanism you would propose that can be pushed and negotiated for in COP to allow for some kind of CSO representative mechanism that bypasses these typical sort of obstacle, issues, these roadblocked sort of pathways? And one associated question, I wonder if do you support the loss and damages techniques that have now been proposed, and recent reports from the Oxfam, for instance, are also pointing towards those. Do you support them, given that we've actually seen that finance is often the problem, which is that when you get money from somewhere, you never take away what you rightly described as the infrastructural background, the structural conditions that give rise to the problems of vulnerabilities to begin with. Just by way of an example, most of the flood-related problems that Pakistan faces, a good proportion of them can be traced to the vulnerabilities that were exacerbated by the development projects that we commenced under the World Bank and other such organizations, as Wali would attest to, especially in Sindh. And given that that's the background we're speaking of, the problem sometimes is not the money. It's the continued, dependence on those networks of policy, on those networks of thought, on those networks of activity, on those networks of, of knowledge that breed all of this in the long run. So given that that's pretty, I know it's a really complex kind of beast, do you have a proposal or some concrete thing that you've been thinking through for this particular COP?
Can I comment, Mariam?
Yes, go ahead, Wali, and then I'll come in.
You just respond because it's directly to you, and then I'll come.
Okay, so I cannot really prescribe what the answer is. It's a really, essential and difficult, thin balance between really not cooperating with our own governments and at the same time having influence when civil society has very little space in these platforms, but also genuine civil society movements from the South have little space. So you have also this layer of international NGOs that are also dominating the narrative of global civil society, which is also very dangerous to the priorities and our interests of our region. So I would say that your questions are quite, strategic, and they really need a kind of a seminar or another discussion precisely for this, to try to see how we can advocate for better engagement of local communities, let's say, and independent civil society organizations in COP, given the structure of COP, which I personally do not have a big, knowledge of. And I think I think I can speak on, from our experience, what and to support and second what you're saying, Zain, is that what made our program, a very big program we have for supporting agriculture in Palestine, what made it succeed was that it was independent and really based on local and regional and individual support of supporters and members. So, but at the same time, I really do think that violators, environmental violators, do have the obligation to compensate for the damage that they have done globally. So how to find this balance of not being, co-opted and, being, driven out of our agenda is something that we need to discuss as civil society. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mariam. Wali, I think you wanted to add in on that, and then I'll call on Josiah after.
I think the most of the comment by Zen is very, concrete and very appropriate in most of the context, not just Pakistani context. Since I've been very active in UNEP civil society process, and also in the HLPF process. So I know very well the dynamics of these forums. But I tend to disagree with Mariam, like she mentioned. I know how they have been facing issues in CFS and other platform. We have been struggling very hard to voice our to raise our voice in these official engagement, in HLPF, in SDG process, in UNEP, where we are in strategically we are there as I'm representing as a farmer major group focal point there, but really in designing of the programs, in contextualizing of the event, we don't have any say. We have to fight even for 3-5 minutes of our speaking assignments, So, and there are different opinion within civil society. So real issues never come up, which is faced by the rural communities. But again, I'll say that without a strong mass mobilization, civil society activism, even inside the official engagement and outside the all these kind of engagement, there need to be a public pressure, a watchdog, which makes sure that anything is happening inside of COP negotiations or SDG negotiation or food negotiations, that voices of the marginalized can be brought in, if not from the inside, a pressure from the outside. That's very important, because I've been for the past 10 years I've been in these policy arenas, and sometimes I feel frustrated why I'm here. I even cannot say what I want to say, because there is a protocols of your statement, there are rules, you need everyone consensus and all that. So, and why don't we include a journal recommendation that each, not just in climate finance, in each aid and finance agreements, there will be a local people presence there, like Zan rightly mentioned, you can name any projects in Pakistan. It will be most of the aid or finance amount went to the consultant, the mechanism which they laid out, and the real amount is left very little, which is really used for development work. So unless or until we ourselves mobilize ourselves in a way where our voice can be heard in a meaningful way, a genuine, meaningful participation of civil society and grassroots communities is the only solution. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wally. And Josiah, I know that you wanted to add a little bit more on our discussion earlier.
I realize I haven't answered clear in terms of reimagining climate finance. There is a need, similar to my other two colleagues, there is a need for an accountable and transparent climate finance mechanism in place. So the movement for global climate action is progressing, but we can only push it further if there are effective accountability mechanisms. For us at the Pacific Island Association of NGO, this begets the work on the public finance management. And for Piango, we've seen how the PFM and tracking the finance, especially on how it's being used, whether it's trickling down to the communities, is something that we are currently doing with 7 countries in the Pacific, with our members in 7 countries in the Pacific. On another note, I know that with climate finance, climate emergency, and promoting sustainable development, there needs to be greater action on mitigation to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, aligning to the 1.5 degree temperature goal to ensure survival of small island communities. This will only be realized by completely phasing out fossil fuels, including no new fossil fuel projects, and ending subsidies and financing of fossil fuel and other carbon-emitting extractive industries. If there's something about climate financing, it needs to finance the just transition of those that are working in extractive industries. In addition, there's a need for climate finance to recognize and embedded and support traditional knowledge. We have nature-based solutions that are being supported and in our communities. These are some initiatives that that we would like to see in a reimagined climate finance. In terms of loss and damage, I believe that there's a need for securing separate, new, and additional financing. In the lead up for us from the Pacific CSOs, we are coming with our message about establishing a global civil society task force under the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, or for non-economic loss and damage. And while we have a global civil society task force, at the regional level, we are already embedded where we have a civil society task force at the regional level when it comes to loss and damage, migration, displacement, relocation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josiah, and thank you so much to all the participants who've been asking amazing questions, especially for Zain, who I think you caught the attention of our speakers and mine as well. Unfortunately, we no longer have any more time for the other members of the audience who have unanswered questions. We will answer them through email and then share them to on social media and to you guys afterwards. Again, thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for all the amazing insights. I would like to call on Nat Lowry from Aid Watch Australia now for the closing remarks.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to, yes, I'm spotlit. Okay, just checking. Look, that was a really amazing session. I would say one of the most powerful ones we've had for Aid Talks. I want to thank you, Mitzi, for moderating. It's been a real privilege to watch your journey on the global stage as a youth leader since I met you in Manila in 2019. You're such an important voice for climate justice. And our speakers, Josiah, Miriam, Wali, and Masum, it has been such an honor to have you here. Your insights are so important. And yeah, I just can't thank you enough. This is such a vital and crucial panel discussion in light of COP27 that starts this Sunday. And as we heard from all the speakers, climate finance is, currently set in this global North, Western, neoliberal and colonial agendas and frameworks. And it's unjust on many levels, as we heard today. And I think we heard this over and over. It just further enables and perpetuates neoliberalism, colonialism, debt, capitalism. And as we're seeing more and more, green capitalism, green extractivism, corporate capture and greenwashing, and the continuation of freezing out voices from the ground, particularly in the global South. And we see this, and we continue to see this at meetings like the COPs and other high-level meetings. And it's not supporting frontline communities, it's only furthering environmental destruction, as well as human rights and community rights violations. There's a real urgent need for us to have the voices from the ground, from the front lines. In other words, and we've heard this as well, decolonize, decolonize, decolonize. And this is a call for real decolonisation of not only aid, but the neoliberal and capitalist structures and systems that currently dominate. And when I say decolonize, I'm not talking about decolonize as a noun. I'm talking about decolonize as a verb. We need to take action. And as someone who sits in the global North, we're really responsible and we really need to sit back. I just want to add today, on a personal note, I was invited to sit on a panel here in Australia that was led by Ritura Talukdar, who is Indian diaspora. I sat on the panel with another First Nations woman, and the discussion was focused on how not only how Australia has failed, but how the Australian climate movement has failed to centre justice and solidarity in its work and in its framing and in its narrative, which only is enabling neoliberalism and, capitalism within Australia and the lack of North-South intersectionality and solidarity. And it is the policies of Australia, our aid, our foreign policies, trade, development in the global North that are ignoring these voices from the ground, from the global South. That is where the real change is. And coming from Australia and the global North, it really is time for us to shut up and listen, deeply listen to our brothers and sisters in the global South. So I want to thank everyone who came today. We really at Aid Talks, on behalf of Aid Watch and Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, we'd really invite you to send us think pieces in response to this webinar. And I'm just going to put here in the chat, so you can email us here. And also please do visit us at our website, aidtalks.org. And also we have our social channels. We have YouTube, we have Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the handle is at Aid Talks. So it's pretty easy to find us. And we will share this recording with you via email. And this will also be turned into a podcast. So we also have our own podcast, and you can go and find out our podcast channels here. I've just put all of that into the chat, and of course we'll share that via email with the recording of this webinar. So thank you all again, a really incredible discussion, and I feel like that there is some other discussions that can come out of this, and hopefully some further aid talks that can expand on what was discussed here tonight. So good morning, good afternoon, good night to wherever you are. It's evening here in Naarm, Australia, commonly known as Melbourne, and thank you very much. Thank you, Mitzi, and thank you, our speakers.
Aid Talks is an educational series discussing the most pressing issues on aid and development cooperation today and the critical issues surrounding it. Co-hosted by Aid Watch Australia and the Reality of Aid Asia Pacific, Aid Talks aims to inform the public on how official development assistance, or ODA, commonly known as aid, provided by donor countries to developing nations and fragile states, is being utilised as aid investment redirected to support private sector players and narrow security priorities over reducing inequality and poverty.